Hey everyone, and welcome back. I'm so excited for today's deep dive because we're tackling a topic that I know a lot of you are curious about, fluency. And not just regular fluency, but like super speed fluency. We're talking about how to become fluent in English in just 6 months. I know, it sounds kind of crazy, right? Like, is that even possible?
Yeah.
That's what we're here to find out. We're dissecting this guide about someone who supposedly did just that, learned to speak English fluently in half a year.
It's definitely a huge goal, but you know what? It is actually possible. It takes a lot of dedication, though, and the right approach. That's kind of the key here.
Basically no pressure then.
Well, there's always going to be some pressure when you're learning something new.
Yeah.
But this guide we're looking at today, it actually emphasizes something that I think gets overlooked a lot. Mindset. Like they say, your mindset is the most crucial thing, even before you get into specific language learning techniques.
Really? Mindset before methods. That's kind of surprising. I always thought it was about finding the right, tools and techniques, like the perfect app or the best textbook.
Those things definitely help, don't get me wrong. But this guide makes a really good point. If you don't have the right mindset from the get-go, it's going to be that much harder to make progress. They use this example of a woman named Sofia who wanted to become fluent in English. And her first goal, to be able to hold a 15-minute conversation in English within 2 months.
Oh, that's interesting. So instead of being overwhelmed by this huge idea of fluency, she broke it down into smaller, more manageable steps.
Exactly. And it's not just about the goal itself, but also how you think about your ability to learn. Instead of getting stuck in that negative self-talk, like, oh, I'm so bad at English, she started using what they call a growth mindset.
Growth mindset. I've heard of that. But what does that actually mean in terms of learning English?
Basically, it means believing that you can improve, that you're not just stuck at a certain level. So Sofia started replacing those negative thoughts with positive ones like, I'm getting better every day. Focusing on progress rather than being perfect.
So just by changing the way you talk to yourself about English, you can actually learn faster.
Yep. And the best part is you can start doing this right now. Literally today, no matter what your level is. Start paying attention to that inner voice and see if you can make it a little more encouraging.
I like that. I like that a lot. There was also this idea of making English a daily habit, like weaving it into your life instead of just having dedicated study time, almost like making a lifestyle change,
Yeah. It's a much more natural way to learn. Think about how kids learn their first language. They don't sit down with flashcards and grammar books. They're just constantly surrounded by the language. So Sofia tried to create that same kind of immersive environment for herself, even though she couldn't travel to an English-speaking country.
Okay, so how did she do that? Because I'm sure a lot of our listeners are in the same boat. They can't just up and move to England or the US.
But she started small. One of the things she did was switch her phone and all her social media settings to English.
Oh, that's clever. It's like those little microdoses of English throughout the day that you don't even realize you're getting. What else did she do?
She listened to a ton of English audio. Podcasts, music, audiobooks, you name it. The guide even mentioned that she listened to the ESL Pod podcast and watched Friends with the subtitles on.
Classic Friends. Who doesn't love Friends?
Right. But there was this one tactic she used that I thought was particularly interesting.
Tell me more.
She would make a conscious effort to think in English. Throughout the day, she'd just narrate her actions to herself in English, even for mundane stuff like I'm making coffee or I'm walking the dog.
Wait, so she'd literally be talking to herself in her head in English? That sounds kind of awkward, but does it actually work?
Apparently it does, and there's actually a lot of science behind it. When you force yourself to think in English, even for simple things, it helps to strengthen the neural pathways in your brain that are associated with language processing.
So it's like you're training your brain to switch to English mode more easily instead of constantly translating back and forth between your native language and English.
Exactly. And the more you do it, the more natural it becomes.
That's pretty cool. Okay, so we've talked about mindset and immersion, but what about the actual nuts and bolts of learning English? Like the grammar, the vocabulary. I know that's where a lot of people get overwhelmed and feel like it's just too much to handle.
I get it. English grammar can be pretty tricky. And the vocabulary, oh man, there's a lot of it. But that's where Sofia's approach gets really smart. Instead of trying to master everything at once, she focused on what she called the most useful parts of the language.
Okay, now I'm curious, what exactly falls under the category of most useful? Because when you're first starting out, it feels like everything is important.
Right, so she started by learning the top 1,000 most common words in English. And get this, those 1,000 words make up about 85% of everyday spoken English.
Whoa, seriously, only 1,000 words for 85% of conversations? That's
It's like-
amazing. Suddenly, English vocabulary feels a lot less intimidating.
Right. And when it came to grammar, she didn't try to memorize every single rule. Instead, she focused on really mastering just the 3 most essential tenses: present simple, past simple, and future simple.
Hold on, are you saying that you can actually have a conversation in English using only 3 tenses?
Well, it's definitely a simplification.
Yeah.
But the point is to build a solid foundation with the most commonly used structures first. You don't need to be grammatically perfect to communicate effectively.
That's a relief to hear. I always thought I needed to know like every single grammar rule before I could even open my mouth.
Nope. It's much better to start speaking sooner rather than later, even if you make mistakes.
So focusing on high-frequency words and those core grammar rules, what else did Sofia include in her most useful toolbox?
Oh, she also learned a bunch of those key phrases that are super helpful in real life situations.
Yeah.
Like, can you repeat that, please? Or I don't understand.
Those are so good. I use those all the time, even now. It's like giving yourself the tools to actually participate in conversations, even if you're not totally fluent yet.
Right. It's all about being able to communicate and connect with people. And speaking of conversations, this is where Sofia's approach takes a bit of a bold turn. Bold is a good word for it.
Yeah.
She didn't wait until she felt, 100% ready to start speaking. She jumped right into conversations basically from day one.
From day one? Wow, that's brave. I think most people, myself included, tend to put off speaking until they feel more confident. It can be scary to like put yourself out there when you know you're still learning.
Totally. But Sofia realized that the best way to get over that fear is to just start speaking, even if you make mistakes. That's actually how you learn the fastest.
So how did she find people to talk to?
She used these online language exchange platforms. You heard of Tandem or HelloTalk?
Yeah, I've heard of those. They sound pretty cool.
They're great. You can connect with native English speakers from all over the world. And you can practice speaking with them, in a safe and supportive environment.
That's awesome. Did she use any specific techniques while she was speaking? Or was it just kind of like free-flowing conversation?
She used a few different techniques. One of them is called shadowing. Basically, you listen to a dialogue in English and then you repeat it out loud, almost like you're trying to become the speaker you're hearing.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. Doesn't that help with your pronunciation?
It does. And it also helps you get a feel for the rhythm and intonation of English, like how native speakers actually sound when they're talking.
That makes sense. So we've talked about listening to English and speaking it, but what about things like watching TV shows or movies? I know a lot of people do that to improve their English.
Right. But the thing is, just passively watching or listening to something isn't really enough. You need to be actively engaging with the material if you want to actually learn from it.
So how do you do that? Like, how do you turn watching TV into something that's actually educational?
Well, Sofia would take notes while she was watching. Like if she heard a new word or phrase, she'd write it down so she could look it up later. She'd also read passages from English books and articles out loud. And sometimes she'd even summarize what she had just watched or listened to.
So she was basically turning these activities that most people do for fun into learning opportunities. I'm starting to see a pattern here. It's all about intentionality.
Yeah. It's about making a conscious effort to use every opportunity to learn and practice English.
I love that. Okay, so we've talked about how Sofia learned English at home. But did she ever actually use her English in the real world?
Oh yeah, totally. She sought out opportunities to practice her English in real-life situations.
Like what kind of situations?
Well, for example, she would order food in English at restaurants, even if she was a little nervous about it. She also kept a daily journal in English. And she joined a few online communities where everyone spoke English.
That's so cool. I think it's easy to get caught up in the world of textbooks and exercises and forget that the ultimate goal is to actually use the language,
Exactly. And the great thing about those real-world situations is that they're usually pretty low pressure. You don't need to be perfect.
It's more about just trying your best and getting comfortable with using the language.
Right. And Sofia also found that it was really helpful to set small goals for herself each week. And then she'd celebrate her achievements no matter how small they were.
I love that. It's so important to celebrate those little wins along the way.
Yeah.
Because learning a language can feel like a really long journey.
Yeah, it definitely can. And another thing Sofia did was she started following other English language learners online.
Oh, that's a great idea.
It really helped her to feel like she wasn't alone in this journey. And it was also really inspiring to see other people making progress and achieving their goals. So yeah, I think Sofia's story is really inspiring, and it shows that with the right approach and a lot of dedication, it really is possible to make significant progress in English in just a few months.
It's so amazing how much she was able to accomplish in such a short amount of time. But you know what? I'm starting to think that maybe 6 months isn't actually that unrealistic. It's definitely challenging, but it's doable.
I agree. And I think one of the biggest takeaways from Sofia's story is that fluency isn't just about talent or natural ability. It's about having the right mindset, the right strategies, and the willingness to put in the work. And I think anyone can do that if they really want to.
Absolutely. So before we wrap up, I want to ask you a question. What do you think are the most important things that our listeners should take away from this deep dive? Like if they could only remember 3 things, what would they be?
3 things, huh? That's a good question. Okay, let's see. First, I'd say, don't be afraid to start speaking from day one. Even if you only know a few words and phrases, just start talking. The more you practice, the better you'll get.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like anything else, the more you do it, the more comfortable you'll become. What about the second thing?
I think it's really important to focus on those high-frequency words and grammar structures. Like we talked about, the top 1,000 words make up a huge percentage of everyday conversations. So if you can master those words and a few basic grammar rules, you'll be able to communicate pretty effectively.
Yeah, and that actually makes learning English feel a lot less overwhelming because it's like, okay, I don't need to know every single word in the dictionary. I just need to focus on the most important ones.
Exactly. And then the third thing, don't forget to create an immersive environment for yourself.
Right. Even if you can't travel to an English-speaking country, there are still so many things you can do to surround yourself with the language.
Like switching your phone settings to English, listening to English podcasts and music, watching English movies and TV shows, and even just like trying to think in English throughout the day.
And make sure you're actively engaging with the material you know. Take notes, read out loud, summarize things. Don't just passively consume it.
Yep. Make it a habit to use English every single day, even if it's just for a few minutes. And before you know it, you'll be amazed at how much progress you've made.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much about how to approach language learning in a more effective and efficient way. And, you know, I think Sofia's story is really inspiring because it shows that it is possible to make significant progress in a relatively short amount of time.
I agree. It's all about having the right mindset, the right strategies, and the dedication to stick with it. And I think anyone can do it if they really set their minds to it.
Well said. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. But before we go, I want to thank you all for listening and for being a part of this conversation. We'll be back next week with another episode, so make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss it. Until then, happy learning, everyone.